Hi there. I'm going to comment on Benjamin Boyce's interview with Paul van der Klee and Jonathan Pageau. As you know, I'm reading a lot of Pageau lately and looking at a lot of his work. So it's about the end of times and that things are falling apart. But why do they think things are falling apart? And Jonathan Pageau says we're living in the most peaceful time materially, but we're living in spiritual fragmentation. This isn't exactly what he said. I'm paraphrasing. And we don't have anything holding us together. He calls it glue. And Paul van der Klee says that we believe competency and pragmatism are sufficient in this country or in the West. And they aren't, because in our quest for objectivity, these are my words, we've forgotten value. We've forgotten quality. We've forgotten the good, the highest. And Benjamin Boyce then says, the standards are falling, the standards are falling. So yeah, we've forgotten value in our quest to make everything objective. And this reflects what's happening in this corner of the internet, from the ongoing sense-making discussion that they're having, to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, to Paul's diverse discussions, of course to Jonathan's analyses with the biblical patterns and cosmology. There's this ongoing feeling that the way we make sense no longer makes sense. It's the end product of the rational knife, where all cohesion has been cut away, and we have strayed too far from the source of what created us. How you want to conceptualize that is going to depend on how you conceptualize the highest, and that would be quality or the good or God, of course. And then so Benjamin Boyce asks Jonathan how he conceptualized worship. And Jonathan says you always celebrate. Worship is a difficult word to understand. So you get together and you celebrate the thing that binds us. But now we have so many competing things. You've got pride, Black Lives Matter, a lot of people constellate under Martin Luther King, who has his own dark side. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Not Martin Luther King's, but we'll talk about the dark side. So if you stop your celebration with the small g, he says, the small god, these principalities, these little gods, then they're all going to fight, because it's going to be sort of tribalism. And the revelation is, if we celebrate the highest, we transcend everything, and everything below, all these warring principalities, become much less contentious because everyone's united under something higher. So in Christianity, you need to see yourself as the lowest of sinners, and you have to do the work inside you. And this is, of course, if you are the lowest of sinners, what does that mean? Well, that's shadow. And if you see yourself as the lowest of sinners, you understand that you have the potential to be just that, the lowest of sinners, you know, the mass murderer. You have it inside of you. You have it, like Jordan Peterson used to say, you have it inside of you to be a Nazi prison guard. And that comes from Jung, of course, who said that we have all the capacities for every human experience inside of us. So Paul says, when you're finger pointing, when you're calling out the other person for being a racist, let's just say, that means that you have not done your own work, that you do not know that it is you who are the sinner. And of course, this is projection. It happens all the time. If you don't understand that this shadow is within you, if you don't understand the devil is within you, then you're going to see it in the other person. And how can you recognize it in the other person if it isn't within you? So Jonathan says real storytelling, and this is related, is being able to inhabit both the good and bad characters. And you have to be able to do that to truly understand yourself. This is going off of this being the lowest sinner. And this is why in very good stories you can relate to both. And that's why great stories are stories often of transformation. For example, Paul van der Klee says that St. Paul was first the oppressor, the killer of Christians, and then he, has a transformation, a conversion. The greatest conversion, you could say, the one that actually brought the word of Christ into the world. And on an earlier video, Jonathan was saying that, with the Chauvin, if you are a white person, which a lot of these messages are directed towards white people, you will identify with Chauvin as a white person, as the killer of the black person, George Floyd's and you also identify with George Floyd because you can feel that foot on your neck. So that's sort of such a powerful image, and it has just become so viral, partially because it satisfies this mythic quality of, the worst oppressor and the most tragic victim in one, and you have both of them inside of you. So healing is happening, says Jonathan Pageau, and I agree with this. It's happening on an individual level in the heart of a person, says John. So God gives us quality, and the choice to send our train down the quality track is what God has given us. And that really, in my understanding, this is my interpretation, but to really understand why that question, when people say, well, why does God kill children? It's not about manipulating the material world. It's about how you deal with it. God gives you something powerful, which is to choose quality, the highest. And while you may suffer, you can overcome and transform this suffering. And that's what God is, I think. And that's why I think why I'm bringing religion into this piercing corner so much, is because I see a strong relationship between this very powerful way that God is spoken of in this corner and the way Pirsig was speaking of being on the quality track and having that as the highest good in his philosophy. So Paul says anyone doing the work understands how hard it is. Yeah, because you really have to confront all the things that you hate about yourself, and it's the hardest thing you can do. So for St. Francis, who is really the most popular saint, I believe, who people really relate to, he was intensely aware of his own sin. And therefore he treated people who were far greater sinners, which most people probably were, with humility and gentleness. And that was very powerful because people respond to love. Now remember, Jonathan Haidt, in his book, he said you can't try to rationalize your position with facts. You have to appeal to the emotion. You have to make a connection with people. Certainly in therapy, you're not going to get anywhere with a patient if you don't have a connection. If you're trying to just lecture them and give them a whole list of CBT things to do, no, you've got to have a good relationship. And of course, the work is hard, and you can't be absolved from this suffering, but it's the transformation of suffering into meaning and glory, says Jonathan, that is promised to us. And that is, again, you have a choice of the quality track, or you have the choice of the selfish and track, and the track of preconceived notions and all the things that keep you stuck. So in Christianity, you're not told to seek suffering, because then that becomes sort of a self-aggrandizing thing, But you understand that suffering is going to happen, and how you deal with it is what the tools that Christianity gives you. So St. Paul had to manifest the killer before he could manifest Christ. And that suffering between those two, the realization of what he was doing and what he became, was that transitional state. And he says, Paul van der Klee says, confession is part of that work. So think about that. It certainly is, because if we're talking about this on a shadow level, to lay out your shadow to a benevolent authority figure, a parent, let's say, which is the role that religious figures often have, that priests often have. This is the source of good attachment with a parent. The parent instills a good pattern that will guide you through the rest of your life. That's secure attachment. So if you can expose your negativity, your negative emotions, your 2-year-old temper tantrums, your flaws in front of someone who really cares about you and who's not going to abandon you despite this, and you see they love you anyway, and they soothe you and help you integrate those experiences, that gives you the strength to tolerate the pain that comes with those emotions, and even more to hold yourself accountable and be responsible with those emotions, because inside of you, you carry that love that they give you, that you can tolerate those emotions, and that you are strong enough to have responsibility to manage them in the world. And this is the key to mental health. So any kind of therapy has to be some kind of repairing attachment problems. And there are very few people on this planet who don't have some variation of it, because parents can be terrible, and they can also be wonderful, but they still are going to have some, they're going to be tired or depressed. Most people are going to have something that they need to repair in their attachment relationship. So I wanted to point out a couple of things that came up in this dialogue that were kind of funny. So Paul Vanderklay said most of the money going to help the poor goes to the people managing the poverty programs, which are people with social work master's degrees, which I have one. And I did work in an agency, and yeah, you can make 6 figures in a high position in an agency if you're a director or something. That is very true. You make some good salaries if you stick with agency work. Work your way up. It's a good career. Benjamin Boyce then said the rainbow flag is being torn apart and becoming ugly, which is so funny, but it's important that you have something very cohesive of good quality becoming bad quality when you introduce these random elements. Cohesion is beautiful, fragmentation is ugly. I mean, think about that postmodern art of the 80s that I keep talking about. It was just pieces pulled out of context, and it is just hideous. And fragmentation, of course, is when it's too far from the source. So Jonathan Pageau says the real rainbow is actually something that is an arc from the sun. It goes around, let's just say figuratively, around the sun. And it is the one, the sun, white light, let's say, and the many, the prismatic effects of the raindrops. It creates the many, but it's very cohesive because it's a natural occurrence of this. It's the whole spectrum of colors in order, in a beautiful order that go from cool to warm. So what is the dying pattern I promised to tell you about? And a couple of people, one person in particular, thought that it might be capitalism. Well, no, it's not capitalism, because I actually think capitalism is broken, but it's also an open system, and it can be repaired, I think, because there's no economic theory worse than capitalism except all the others. And this will be a controversial thing for me to say, but the dying pattern is racism. Everyone, except a small group of educated progressives, wants racism to die. Everyone does. There may be some disparate people who play the race card, but that's actually another problem. That's not that's a personality problem, or an attachment disorder, or all sorts of things. And in fact, I should say that one of the biggest problems plaguing poor people is stressed parenting. So that's one, if you want to actually repair poor communities, I'm not just talking Black, and in poverty, there's a lot of problems with parents who have who are stressed or don't have a cohesive household for various reasons that poverty really encourages. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but the evidence for the fact that racism wants to die, yet it seems to be reborn, if that book White Fragility is any indication. White Fragility says, no, it's not dying, it's not dying, it's not dying. See, here's all the evidence. And that book goes to great lengths to demonstrate that that it's not dying. And they're obviously desperate to maintain it. It has these elements of a last gasp, where you get this energy, before death, and it's become so fragmented. The only way to contain it is behind this wall, which is, of course, the cultural immune system. And that cultural immune system, the whole critical race thing, the white fragility thing, it has that telltale jargon and tenets and principles. And so it is a function within that cultural immune system to actually further fragment this material, these ideas. So it gives you the impression that they're very, you know, progressive and they're changing with the times. But actually, you just take the same material and you fragment it and fragment and fragment further and further. So they seem to be updating and changing, and not in a cultural immune system, but in fact they are. It's just the same critical race theory ideas, further fragmenting and keeping out both dynamic updating from above, wisdom, you know, spirit. We're talking the one of the main symbols of the biblical cosmology, which is the wisdom and spirit come from above to change, to update, change things. You could call it dynamic quality in the Pearson system. And from below you get support. You could call that static patterns valued from the bottom. And the problem with these cultural immune system is they keep both out. They're not supported by the good ideas from the past, and they keep out the good ideas that are down the that are coming up on the track of quality. So let me read something from White Fragility just to prove this to you. As I've tried to show throughout this book, white people raised in Western society are conditioned into white supremacist worldview because it is the bedrock of our society and its institutions. Regardless of whether a parent told you that everyone was equal, or the poster in the hall of your white suburban school proclaimed the value of diversity, or you have traveled abroad, or you have people of color in your workplace or family, the ubiquitous socializing power of white supremacy cannot be avoided. The messages circulate 24/7 and have little or nothing to do with intentions, awareness, or agreement. That's a pretty strong declaration, and let's just say that is a strong opinion too. So this cultural immune system is, of course, a circular hierarchy, and it's an inversion of that circular hierarchy. Instead of the center of it, you know, which is competency, I guess you could say, meritocracy, and the primacy of the individual, that is on the outside. And as is the dreaded white male who supposedly stands for those values. And as almost a pinnacle of inversion, D'Angelo, you probably heard about this. You probably heard about this poster at the Museum of African American History that someone wrote that sounds like Ku Klux Klan literature. And Benjamin Boyce did a whole thing on this. And up until a few moments ago, I was still operating under the impression that was still in on the website, but apparently Benjamin said that they just took it down. But I'm going to include a link to that anyway, because it shows how far the inversion has gone. And white culture, aspects and assumptions of white culture include the individual is the primary unit, self-reliance, independence and autonomy highly valued. Individuals assumed to be in control of their environment, and emphasis on scientific method and Protestant work ethic. Hard work is the key to success. Work before you play. If you don't meet your goals, you didn't work hard enough. So it's saying that these things are somehow only, you know, that this is white culture. So what does that mean black culture is? I mean, the implications are really kind of, you can see why someone would call this racist literature. It goes on and on with this stuff. You know, some of it is not as obvious. Some of it is kind of bad, like win at all costs. You know, is that part of white culture? I don't know. It's not a good thing. So another way to understand what's happening is that racism, let's just say racism and a society that feels racism is being overcome is like a couple. So this couple has kind of resolved things, you know, there's still some grudges, but they feel like they're moving in the right track. You know, racism feels like the society that thinks it's solving racism is doing something about it, and the society that thinks it's resolving racism thinks that racism is getting better. But one night, this couple gets drunk, and every single grievance we thought was resolved is on the table again. And this can be good in a sense if this is exposing the shadow. If all this critical race theory and white fragility stuff was exposing a shadow, it might be a good thing, because if we are exposing a shadow and we have to integrate it, that's one thing. But that's questionable, because a lot of the things we're seeing in critical race theory really do seem to be cultural immune system, and there is an awful lot of economic incentive to maintain this cultural immune system. And I think that there's been some exposure as to what D'Angelo makes and what this other guy, Howard Morris, there was another fellow who's made millions of dollars doing diversity trainings, so there's a lot of money in this. So maybe this is exposing some shadow, or maybe the actual cultural immune system is the shadow, I don't know. Or maybe it could further perpetuate the church of equity, diversity, and inclusion, informed by critical race scripture. So then Benjamin Boyce asked Jonathan, if we can't rely on, or asked both of them, if we can't rely on competency, what is the value? And Jonathan says the solution is hierarchy, is real hierarchy. And in order for hierarchy to function, there has to be care and love, again, from above, and support and trust from below. So that holy from above and earthly from below in meeting in the center with the human being, that is the pattern of how things work in biblical cosmology, and in fact is how things work at all, which is the point. So the parent, let's just say, has to care. And if the parent doesn't care, the kids are going to rebel, and then the parents are going to become really authoritarian, but it's too late. And he says the pendulum cannot go infinitely in one side. Things will flip, which is why D'Angelo, like I said, may be less dangerous than she seems, despite how chaotic, divisive, and fragmented the material is. I mean, the book is really kind of incredible. It just goes on and on with these same presumptions. But there's a lot of dialogue, in this dialogue with these three guys. They're trying to figure out how serious this thing is, because you've got this promise of something flipping, you've got things happening, rebel wisdom, trying to understand a new way of sense making, you've got things happening, you've got people coming back to Christianity. But what if this takes such a long time that, our lives are kind of screwed up for a while? So we want this to happen as soon as possible. So is the church a cultural immune system? Not if it can evolve. That means it needs to let things in. There does need to be some modernization. What the difference is between a high quality pattern of value versus a cultural immune system is that the cultural immune system is totally invested in not changing. The actual structure of Christianity is based on these patterns that the Pageaus talk about, and they are patterns that reflect the nature of reality. So they're very, very powerful. This is a very strong pattern of social pattern of value, Pirsig would say. And that means it's very enduring. So certainly individual churches can become, and certainly have become, cultural immune systems. But operating under the principle of Christ's love, let's say, a church who gives anyone who wants to be part of the church a chance means that the church, too, has to stop seeing identities. Like gay and female can't matter anymore. Now, I know there will be some debate as to whether women should be priests, and you could probably make an argument that they shouldn't, in a very conservative way that still has a progressivism in the sense that it's getting back to the old patterns. Ironically, the progressive is getting back to the old patterns. My personal opinion is probably not. Probably if a woman wants to be a priest, she should be able to be a priest. I don't think identity should matter anymore in the church. So the church needs to be that parent with that agapic love for anyone who wants to be part of it, and guide the parishioners on this difficult path of self-transformation, which means all that stuff we were talking about, love your neighbor, meaning dispensing with preconceived notions, find your shadow and confront your own shadow so you're not projecting onto other people. And like the parent we talked about in the attachment piece we were talking about earlier, is that church, that parent, those representatives of the church, teach you how to tolerate and transform your brokenness. So in terms of this whole thing that's going on with the identity stuff and the critical race and all that, Jonathan Pageau says, inclusion cannot be the only value. This is not how the world works. What's best is to know who you are at all levels and be able to love those who are outside. So you need to love the stranger. Again, my interpretation of this is that love is dispensing with preconceived notions and being open to the person as he is, which means you have to work on the value traps of value rigidity and ego that Pirsig was talking about and Gumption Chautauqua that I keep referring to. But love isn't capitulating. It's not just being meek, let's just say. It's a back and forth to a more harmonious understanding. Like Jonathan says, it's the left and right hand. One pulls closer, the other keeps away. It's balance. And remember what C.S. Lewis said, it's a little bit difficult to comprehend. You probably have to read the whole book, Mere Christianity. But you can love your enemy at the same time that he is your actual enemy in a wartime situation. You know, you don't hate the person, you're participating in a circumstance. So both Paul and Jonathan say that Jesus is the way out of this mess, that in Christ is love and God is love. Pirsig would say quality is that caring, and he's again, you know, very related to quality. God is the infinite one and many at the same time. Quality inheres in everything and creates everything. So the key to this, to dealing with a fragmented world and the topsy-turvy world and the chaos and becoming the sort of person who can weather this, becoming the individual who is strong enough to handle this, the key is self-sacrifice first. Again, we went through what those things are. After you go through this transformation, you are, I love this, Jonathan says, you're a healing mechanism for the world. In other words, you do all that work and you learn how to dispense with preconceived notions, and you've met your shadow, and you learn how to love the stranger. So when we have this breakdown that we're having, these random associations, we come to the end of fragmentation and we see that unity is the only answer, and that unity should be under the highest. Paul Vanderklay says, can you bring God back into the conversation that doesn't look cringy? Well, we are, I think, going back to God, because our notion of God, think about it, it's updated in our consciousness since we have been conscious. And for example, at one time, God was punitive, and then with the advent of Christ, God becomes benevolent. So as our consciousness updates with God, in union with God, we update our understanding of God, and God looks very different to modernity than he did to the ancient Hebrews. So everyone in this corner, secular or religious, is heading steadily toward that wisdom. I mean, look at all the stuff that's happening: Rebel Wisdom, John Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis, Jonathan Pageau's channel, Paul Vanderklay's channel, and all these associated channels. Everyone is, Benjamin Boyce, everyone is headed towards that wisdom, that spiritual principle, that seed that creates the universe. Because even though we may not know it explicitly, implicitly, this is where we're headed. We want what's better. And we're sort of constellating around a similar idea of what's better, because after all this materialism, we're trying to realign with that original seed of creation that creates the universe in a way that's harmonious, where the pattern of creation guides our own creation and manifestation in the world. How this is going to happen has yet to be seen, because a lot of stuff has happened since we lost that connection. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.